My name is Michael Carter. I am 68 years old. I was born and have lived most of my life in Boston, Massachusetts. And as strange as it may seem, what I'm about to tell you could change everything you believe about life, death, and what comes after. For decades, I was the kind of man who believed only in what I could see, touch, and measure. An engineer by training from MIT, a skeptic by nature, and a convinced atheist by choice. I grew up in a house where logic was the law. My father was a physicist, my mother a math teacher. At our dinner table, God was just an outdated concept, something people invented to make themselves feel better about the unknown. Throughout my life, I have built bridges, buildings, worked with large corporations, always seeking precision. And the more I immersed myself in numbers, the less room there was for faith. I remember well a conversation with my maternal grandmother, a simple woman from rural Alabama. She said to me with tears in her eyes, "Michael, one day you will understand. Jesus is real." And I laughed. I laughed with pity. "Grandma, with all due respect, this is just fantasy. We die, and that's it." If I had known what was coming. But before I continue, if this story is already touching something inside you, no matter how small, I ask you, like this video and subscribe to the channel. Maybe you don't know why yet, but later on, you'll understand. I always thought faith was a crutch, something people used when they had nothing else to lean on. And for me, reason was everything. While my grandmother prayed, I solved equations. While she read the Psalms, I devoured books on quantum physics. But you see, I wasn't a bad man. I just thought I had all the answers. In my youth, I argued with street preachers, dismantled religious arguments in online forums, and was even invited to debates on science and faith at universities. I liked to win, to prove with data and logic that God was just a concept invented by scared brains. One Christmas, my mother asked me to go to her childhood church. Just to please her, I went. I sat in the back pew, arms crossed, eyes critical. The pastor spoke about redemption, about unconditional love, about a man who died for us. And me? All I could think about were the historical inconsistencies, the missing evidence, the scientific paradoxes. I was that guy who said, "If God exists, why is there so much pain in the world? Why do children die? Why are there wars in His name?" And no one could answer me in a way that made sense to me. My life was moving in a straight line. Professional success, good investments, a comfortable home in Newton, an upscale suburb of Boston. I had an impeccable routine. Gym at 6 a.m., work until 7 p.m., red wine at 8 p.m., reading until bed. Everything under control. But what about the heart? You know what I never realized? That my soul was empty. I had friends, but no real connections. I had recognition, but no peace. And deep down, though I would never admit it, there was a fear that silently haunted me. What if I'm wrong? On one of those lonely nights, I heard a phrase from a philosopher that made me feel a bit uncomfortable. Modern man has built rockets that go to the moon, but he still stumbles upon the oldest questions of existence. I pretended to ignore it, but it stayed. Because even with all my logic, with all the science, there was a void that I couldn't fill. And fate, or something bigger, was about to show me that there was much more to it than I could have imagined. An invitation to a conference in Chicago would arrive the following week. I didn't know, but that event would change everything. I would change who I was. It was a cold November morning when I boarded a flight to Chicago. I went to speak at an engineering and innovation conference. I'd done this hundreds of times before. A packed auditorium, bright lights, important people in the audience. I felt right at home. I walked on stage in my signature navy blue blazer and a practiced smile. I started my presentation as usual. Numbers, statistics, graphs, everything in place. But something was strange. A slight dizziness, a cold sweat on the back of his neck. I thought, maybe it's just the breakfast or the air conditioning. But then, a pain came, sudden, deep, like something was tearing my chest apart from the inside. My hands began to shake. My vision became blurred. The voices in the background turned into a distant echo. The microphone fell out of my hand, and in front of hundreds of people I fell. The last thing I heard before everything went dark was someone shouting. He stopped breathing. Then, silence. Everything went absolutely black. But it wasn't just an absence of light. It was a darkness that felt alive, heavy, as if time had stopped. as if I was nowhere. I tried to scream, but I had no voice. I tried to move, but I had no body. It was like floating in an endless void, where all that remained was consciousness. A frighteningly lucid consciousness. And then something hit me like a bolt of lightning. I died. The penny dropped there, in the middle of nowhere. There were no walls, no sky, no floor, no stars. Nothing. Just a dense, absolute silence. And a question whispering inside me. Is this it? The end? For a moment I felt indescribable despair. The kind of fear that can't be explained. It wasn't the fear of dying. It was the dread of to have lived in vain, having spent decades denying something that, maybe, was real. And it was in that moment, in that total absence, that a light has appeared. Small, distant, but so bright that it made everything around it seem even darker. She approached slowly, as if she wasn't running, but catching up to me. And in that icy void, for the first time, I felt heat. The light came with a peace I had never experienced in my entire life. And in that moment, I knew I was no longer alone. The light approached, but around it, the void remained absolute. It was as if the entire universe had disappeared. No sound, no time, no color, but that clarity. But the scariest thing wasn't the dark. It was the consciousness within the dark. I knew I wasn't dreaming. I knew my mind wasn't creating it, because it was all more real than anything I had ever experienced in a waking state. I felt every thought with supernatural clarity. And then, I started to remember. I remembered my childhood in Boston, my first bicycle, the smell of my mother's cake. I remembered the day I defended my thesis at MIT, and also the day I teased a friend for believing in angels. Memories came like arrows, and with each one, a pain. Not physical, but emotional, as if my soul was being confronted with everything I had been, and everything I could have been. And then came a second void, worse than the first. Not the emptiness around me, but the emptiness within me. You know that kind of regret that we hide even from ourselves? The one we silence with work, distractions, alcohol, series, routine? There, in that timeless space, there was nowhere to hide. Every harsh word, every selfish gesture, every disregard for the other's pain, everything came back. And I had no more excuses, no arguments, no logic, not even science. There was only me, and the echo of my conscience. I felt small, ridiculous, a man who spent his entire life saying God doesn't exist, and now, he begged, silently, for there to be something, anything. It was at this point that I realized, the biggest void was not the place where I was. That's who I became. And just when that feeling seemed unbearable, the light came closer. And the most incredible thing, man, is that she didn't judge me. There was no accusation, no conviction. There was presence. The light did not speak, but it enveloped me, as if to say, I'm here, even now, even then. And it was then that in the center of that light a figure appeared, tall, serene, surrounded by a peace that human words cannot describe. I didn't see a face clearly, but I knew. Somehow, inexplicably, I knew. It was him, Jesus. Not like a stained glass image, not like in the movies, but as a living, real, intense presence that touched something inside me that I didn't even know existed. And the most impressive thing is that, at that moment, I wasn't afraid. He didn't say a word, but I felt as if my soul recognized something my mind had spent its entire life denying. It was Jesus. There was no doubt. And it wasn't an idea, a belief, a metaphor. It was someone. His presence was so intense that it seemed to penetrate everything. My reason, my pride, my resistance. I felt every cell of my being vibrating before him. Time has stopped, and suddenly, everything I thought I knew no longer mattered. He looked at me, and in that look, there was no judgment. There was something that completely dismantled me. Compassion. I prepared myself to be accused. I expected a sentence, a conviction, a "you made a mistake." But what I received was love, and not just any love. It was a love that knew me completely. Every thought, every hidden act, every wrong choice, and yet, he hugged me. At that moment, I began to see scenes from my life unfolding before me. But now, with his eyes, I saw the times when I hurt people with harsh words. I saw the days when I ignored calls for help. I saw the looks I despised, the hearts I hardened, and I cried. I cried like I had never cried in my entire life. But it wasn't guilt. It was pure regret. It was a desperate desire to go back and do everything differently, to love more, to listen more, to forgive more. And the most amazing thing, even with all this before him, Jesus did not look away. On the contrary, he came closer. It was as if he were saying without words, "I know who you are, and yet, I love you." At that moment, I surrendered, not because I was defeated, but because I was welcomed. And here, opening my heart to you who are listening to me, I wanted to ask you something. Comment below if this is touching you in any way. It could be a phrase, a feeling, or even a doubt. Maybe your story needs to be told too, and maybe this is the beginning of it. Now take a deep breath with me, because what comes next is even deeper. There are no words in the human vocabulary that can describe what I felt at that moment. Jesus' gaze was not made of ordinary light. It was made of something that pierced the soul. I, Michael Carter, 68 years old, engineer, atheist by conviction, was on my knees before a gaze that demanded nothing of me. It simply revealed to me who I really was. For the first time in my life, I saw myself completely. Not the respected professional nor the renowned speaker, but the man behind the masks, the lonely boy, the arrogant young man, the disconnected adult. Jesus didn't say a word, but his silence spoke louder than any sermon. It said, "I've been with you every moment. Even when you said I didn't exist, I've never stopped being there." And it tore me apart inside. His presence didn't diminish me. Quite the opposite. It made me feel seen. It made me feel like I belonged. Like, despite everything, there was still hope. There was still purpose. There was still forgiveness. There, in the middle of that space with no ground or sky, everything made sense. I understood that I had spent my entire life running away from the simplest and most powerful truth of all. We are not alone. We never have been. The universe is not a cold and meaningless accident. There is a force, a presence, a person who loves us with a love that does not demand performance, religion, or curriculum. Only surrender, only surrender, only truth. And then came the hardest moment. Jesus looked at me once more, a look full of peace, but with a depth that broke me into 1,000 pieces. And without needing to speak, I understood. It was not my time. I would not stay there. I needed to go back. At that moment, my heart wanted to scream. I wanted to stay. For the first time in my life, I wanted to stay. This was home. This was peace. This was where everything inside me finally fit together. But I couldn't. It was as if something was pulling me back. An irresistible call, like a magnet. Jesus came even closer, and in an indescribably tender gesture, he extended his hand toward me. I felt as if his light invaded every corner of my being. It was as if he left a piece of himself inside me. A seal, a reminder, a purpose. And then, in the blink of an eye, everything went dark again. The light disappeared, the peace dissolved, and I was thrown back, brutally, into the world I knew. But something in me would never be the same again. When I opened my eyes, the world seemed wrong. The white lights of the hospital blinded me. The sound of the monitors sounded metallic, distant. There were voices, people running, and a smell of alcohol and despair in the air. I didn't know where I was. For a moment, I thought it had all been a dream, a delirium of a dying brain. But then, I felt it. Inside me, something different was still pulsing. Something that wasn't from here. My body was weak. Tubes in my mouth, needles in my arms, a constant beeping sound next to my head. Doctors and nurses surrounded me. One, wide-eyed, said, "He's back. Oh my God, he's back." Another was shaking. 7 minutes. 7 minutes without a heartbeat. This doesn't make sense. But it did. To me, it made all the sense in the world. The first tear fell before I fully understood what had happened. It wasn't fear. It was gratitude. It was the weight of a miracle that was impossible to explain with formulas or scientific articles. I cried, like a newborn baby, because that's what I was at that moment, someone reborn. In the following days, I was kept under observation. I was subjected to exams, neurological tests, psychological questionnaires. No one could explain how I survived, and even more so, how I came back without any after effects. One doctor even said, "Michael, you should be dead. There is no explanation for this." I just looked at him, held his hand, and smiled. "Maybe there is. It's just not in the medical books." But the most impactful thing was not the physical return. It was what happened inside me. It was as if I carried a different heart. I saw the people around me with different eyes. Nurses, cleaners, patients. They all seemed charged with a value that I had never perceived before. As if suddenly each life had a glow, a meaning, a place in the whole. And with that came a call. I didn't hear voices. There were no angels with trumpets. But something inside me said loudly, "You need to tell. You need to live differently. You need to love as you were loved." It was like I had been given a mission, a chance to start over, but this time, with purpose. In the silence of the hospital's early mornings, I cried softly, not out of pain, but out of reverence. I had been touched, and now, I could no longer live as before. I thought of my grandmother, of her sweet words, of her simple faith, of everything I had arrogantly dismissed. She was right. God was real. Jesus was real. And now, I knew it with every fiber of my being. In the days that followed my discharge, many things still awaited me. Disbelief, doubts from others, radical changes. But one thing was certain. I would never be the same man who stepped onto that stage in Chicago. Coming back to the real world was, in some ways, harder than being on the other side. Because here, everything seemed out of place. The days after I was discharged were strange. It was like living in an old movie with the sound and image out of sync. The city seemed too noisy, the people too rushed, the world too distracted, and silent. I couldn't tell anyone what I had experienced. Not even my children, not even my doctors, not even my closest friends. How can I explain that I was dead for 7 minutes, saw Jesus, and came back different? How can I put into words something that not even time can explain? I tried, but every time I opened my mouth, emotion interrupted me. My throat got stuck. Tears came before I could speak. So I chose silence, at least for a while. But while words failed me, my actions began to speak for me. I, who had barely paid any attention to my family before, started making unexpected visits. I cooked with my granddaughter for the first time. I called my brother, whom I hadn't spoken to in years, just to apologize. I went back to the neighborhood where I grew up. I walked the streets of my past, and I sat in the pew of the church I once despised. I didn't go in. I just sat, and I cried. My cell phone, which used to be an extension of my body, was turned off for days. Social media no longer made sense. The news seemed like a repetition of a world screaming for something it refused to hear. And everything in me said, live differently, show who I am. With what you do, not just with what you say. People started to notice. A former colleague called me curious. "Michael, are you okay? You seem like a different person." "I'm better than ever," I replied. "But you almost died, man." Or maybe, I was almost born. I started to have more patience. I started to look people in the eye. I started to really listen. Simple things. But for those who knew me before, this was a miracle. And it really was. I returned to the company for a few days. But the feeling was suffocating. The goals, the deadlines, the empty meetings, then everything seemed soulless. One afternoon I walked into the CEO's office, and a friend of mine for decades, and said, "I have to go." He frowned. "Go where?" "Inside. Out. Towards God. I don't know. I just know that here is no longer my place." I handed in my resignation letter. I left behind salary, status, stability, but I took with me something that money could never buy, meaning, and so began the transition. From a skeptical engineer to a man in search of souls, not by imposition, but by compassion. Returning to ordinary life with a transformed soul is like trying to keep the sea in a glass. The routine seemed absurd to me. The conversations were superficial. The interests that had previously moved me now tired me. In the first few months after my experience, I was overcome by a silence that frightened even myself. It was like I was learning to live again, but with a new language, a new look, a new heart. I woke up every morning at 5 in the morning. I sat on the porch with a cup of coffee and just listened. The wind, the birds, the city waking up. And there, without a single word, I felt God more present than I had ever felt in any church or speech. But there was trauma too. Because as incredible as what I experienced was, carrying something like that alone is a weight that only those who have been through it understand. People wanted me to go back to who I was. Shall we have some wine like before, Michael? Have you seen the stock market numbers? Dude, we need you on that project. And I just smiled, but inside something screamed, I saw Jesus. I died. I came back. And you're worried about Apple stock? But I didn't blame them. I'd been blind too. I've been deaf for over 60 years. And now, how can we explain in words a song that only the heart can hear? I started writing. Pages and more pages. Entire diaries. But not to publish. It was a way to cleanse the soul. To process the truth. Because believe me, even when Atheist Jesus, living with this in this world is not easy. One night, I had an emotional breakdown. I was alone. I sat on the kitchen floor and cried until I couldn't breathe. Not of sadness, but of weight, of spiritual burden, of impotence. I wanted to shout to the world, wake up, there is something greater. There is love. There is life after death. But the world seemed asleep. And then I understood. It was not enough to talk, it was necessary to be the reflection of that gaze, to be the echo of that light, to be love, where before I was logic. That's when I started walking the streets of my city with another purpose. I began to see the invisible, the homeless, the sick, the lonely, and something inside me said, this is where it starts. Everything changed the day I sat down next to a homeless man and simply listened. I didn't preach. I didn't offer solutions. I didn't talk about Jesus. I just sat there next to him on the cold Atlanta sidewalk with 2 cups of coffee. And I heard. His name was Thomas. He was 52 years old with a hoarse voice and a tired look in his eyes. He spoke about his childhood in Savannah, the war in Iraq, the woman who left him, the addiction that took over later. As he spoke, I saw the boy inside that broken man. And I realized that in a way I was there too, invisible, broken, lost inside, even in a suit and tie. After that conversation, I went home and cried like a baby. Not for him, but for me. For all the time I lived blind to so much pain around me. It was then that I clearly understood the calling I received on the day of my near-death experience. It wasn't to open a church, nor to become a preacher. It was simpler and deeper. To love as he loved me. To serve as he served. Not with speeches, but with presence, with listening, with touch, with bread, with hugs. I sold my house in Newton. I donated half of what I had. I bought a used van, converted it into a home on wheels, and headed down to the Georgia countryside, where the shelters were always full and hearts were always empty. I started visiting hospitals, orphanages, forgotten communities. In each place, I found someone who needed less answers and more affection. And in every face I met, it was as if I saw that look again. Yes, the gaze of Jesus. I didn't need to repeat the experience I had. I needed to multiply its effect. I started writing notes by hand and leaving them in unknown mailboxes with messages like, you are loved, don't give up. God is still with you, even when you don't feel it. The light that saved you still shines within you. And inexplicably, people started looking for me. Not for fame, but because of something different. Michael, I've heard about you. They say you saw something. Do you think God can forgive me? Does he still hear me? And I answered with the only truth I know. He never stopped listening. We were the ones who stopped listening. One day, sitting under a tree next to a lady with terminal cancer, she took my hand and said, you brought me peace, and you didn't even try to convince me of anything. I smiled, because that was it. That was my new mission. Do not convert, but reveal. Reveal through my life what I saw on the other side. It was on a cloudy afternoon in Macon, Georgia, that the unlikely happened. I was in a public square, helping to distribute meals with a group of local volunteers. Nothing special. Simple lunchboxes, sincere smiles, silent hugs. And it was there, between a packet of rice and a silent prayer, that I saw a face that froze my blood. Era David McAllister, college colleague, former atheist debater, famous in our circles for his militancy against any idea of faith. He had written books, given lectures, humiliated preachers. And now, there it was. Thinner, deep-set eyes, an expression of someone carrying much more than the weight of time. He recognized me immediately. He came towards me, his steps slow, an ironic smile at the corner of his mouth. Michael Carter, The man who came back from the dead and became a popular saint. Is this real or just desperate marketing? The provocation was clear. In the past, I would have responded in kind, exchanged barbs, defended theses. But something in me was different now. I took a deep breath. I looked into his eyes, and he said calmly, "I'm not here to convince you of anything, David. I'm just trying to live what I saw." He laughed, but it was a broken laugh, a sad laugh. "Do you really believe you saw Jesus?" "No, I be that I saw." He looked at me for a few seconds in silence. Then he lowered his eyes, and for the first time in decades, he looked vulnerable. We sat down on a bench. He took a bottle of cheap whiskey out of his pocket and offered it to me. I politely declined, and then he began to speak. He said that after the success of his books, he lost everything: family, money, health. He said his youngest daughter committed suicide, that the guilt consumed him, who tried to find peace in 1,000 ways and in all of them, found emptiness. "And now you're here," he said, his voice breaking. "And even after everything I said against God, against Jesus, you only listen to me. Why?" I looked at him and replied, "Because that's how he looked at me, and that's how I need to look at you." David started to cry. In truth, no defenses, no cynicism, just pain. In that square among silent trees and the distant sound of the city, he asked me something I never thought I would hear from his mouth. "Can you pray for me?" And there, with his hand squeezing mine, the improbable happened. A man who defied God his entire life prayed his first sincere prayer. It wasn't perfect, nor pretty, but it was real. And when we were done, David looked at me and said, "I may never be able to believe like you, but today, I feel something different." I smiled. "You don't have to believe like I do. You just have to make room for him to come in." Over the next few months, we stayed in touch. He started attending support groups. He quit drinking. He wrote a new book, not about faith, but about humility. And I understood. Sometimes the greatest miracle is not someone seeing Jesus. It's someone being able to see themselves and still be embraced. The last interview was not in a studio, not even in a church. It was recorded in the simple bedroom of a house in Savannah, with the curtains half open, the afternoon light streaming through the window, and an old camera resting on a stack of books. Time had passed. The body no longer had the same vigor. A diagnosis of advanced pancreatic cancer had placed me on a new countdown, but this time, I wasn't afraid. I felt peace. Peace of those who have made peace with heaven and with earth. Peace of those who lived with purpose after a life of denial. Peace of those who had the chance to return and use the time they had left to love. It was my oldest grandson, Josh, who pressed the record button. I asked him not to edit anything, to leave the heavy breathing, the silences, the emotional pauses, because this recording wasn't about vanity. It was about truth. I looked into the lens. I knew it might be my last time telling this story, and with a weak but firm voice, I began, "My name is Michael Carter. I'm 68 years old, and if you're watching this, you may need to hear something that's taken me my entire life to understand." I spoke of my arrogance, of pride disguised as logic. I spoke of death, of darkness, from the light that found me, from the look that transformed me. I spoke of Jesus, not as a religious symbol, but as someone real, present, personal. I spoke of the new mission, of the unlikely encounters, of the hands holding other hands, of the eyes in the eyes. I spoke of the beauty of serving, of the power of forgiveness, of the greatness of a faith lived in everyday life. And at the end, before Josh turned off the camera, I looked straight at whoever would one day watch that video and said, "If you think it's too late, if you believe that there is no way to fix it, if you have been hurt by religion, by men, by loss, I understand, but it's not about religion. It's a love that has already forgiven you before you even asked, and that is still here, just waiting for you to open the door." I smiled, and before closing I whispered one last sentence, not to the camera, but to the one who was waiting for me. "I'm ready now." 3 weeks later, I left. Not by shouting, not with tubes or agony, but sleeping, with a slight smile on his face, with the peace of someone who has seen the other side and is no longer afraid. Today, this story is in your hands, not for admiration, but, perhaps, for transformation. Because if even a man like me, skeptical, tough, rational, can be touched by grace, Who's saying you can't be too? Thank you for listening to me. Now, it's up to you. If this story touched you, subscribe to the channel to receive more stories that transform. Leave a like. This helps this message reach more people. And if you got this far, comment, "I believe in the power of transformation." It might be the inspiration someone needs. The next video is already on the screen. Click and continue this journey with us.